Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris.
And we're doing something new today. Hopefully it works okay. We are amid the COVID crisis we're all enduring. We decided to utilize some of the video technology, and we're going to record a video conference. And so we'll see how this goes. And my hope is that we're going to have this in audio format, of course, as a podcast, as we always do, but also upload the video to our YouTube channel so we can grow our audience in that regard. And so on this maiden voyage, we have Donnie Drager is with us. Donnie, if you remember, he joined us a little over a year ago on a podcast where we discussed culling and talked about that incredible 13-year project that he orchestrated on the ranch he manages in South Texas. Welcome, Donnie.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate both of y'all having me here. Good to be back.
Well,
Good to talk to some adults, actually. I've got a 4-year-old that takes most of my time. So, yeah.
I can imagine. Donnie, what we wanted to do is, of course, culling is complicated. I don't know. I'm sure I am wrong. I typically am. But I don't know of a more debated, discussed, contentious topic in the deer management world. And what we wanted to do today is kind of a follow-up with you and kind of a compare and contrast with some of the different selective harvest strategies and clear up some of the confusion regarding when it might be appropriate for selective harvest and when it is not. So if you don't mind, I want to kick things off with you, Donnie, and maybe just give us a snapshot of what was the objective when y'all embarked on this big study. What were you hoping to accomplish with that study?
So it was on the heels of a study done by Mick Hellickson and Texas Parks and Wildlife at the King Ranch, which showed no significant changes in their culling pastures versus their control pastures. And we felt that we could improve upon that methodology and their controls of immigration and emigration, right? So we felt that we really had a unique opportunity to do that. So in 2006, we embarked upon that. And the flat goal of the purpose of that study was to determine if culling can positively affect antler sizes on large acreage. And our hope was that it would. And that we felt that we could influence with the ability to use helicopters and things like that nature and the size of the ranch that we had, that we could influence those genetic traits into the next generation and therefore have bigger deer down the road. And so that was, to answer your question concisely, that was it. That was a hope. And the study is, can we prove that it works? Now, we're analytical people on this ranch, and we didn't want to just throw caution into the wind and do it. We wanted some empirical evidence.
Clear things up real quick, Steve. Clear things up, Donnie. When you say pasture, for all us non-South Texas people, what do you mean when you say pasture?
Well, a pasture is a section of a ranch that usually started back in the old grazing days that had a low fence, and you'd keep cattle in that section and move them to the next and move to the next. But for, Comanche Ranch, just to refresh everybody's memory, is 113,000 acres in Maverick, Dimmitt County, down in the Golden Triangle of Texas. We're near the town of Eagle Pass. And our three areas that we studied, there was the moderate pasture, or let me rephrase that, the moderate area. It had many pastures in it. That was 18,000 acres. The intense area was 3,500 acres, and then the control pasture was 5,000 acres. So we're talking big acreage here, by anyone's standards. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
So when you were referring to the King Ranch study, led by Mick Hellickson, you started off by saying pasture. And I just wanted to make sure people understood. We're not talking about a 50-acre pasture here with a treatment and a 50-acre pasture there. There's thousands
and if
of
I
acres.
remember right, I think they were close to 5,000 on treatment and control. It may have varied slightly on that, but so they were quite large too.
And what you mentioned, one of the potential limitations to their study, Donnie, was that they had an issue with immigration and emigration, animals moving in and out because they were low fenced in their treatment areas. And your improvement, one of your specific improvements, is your treatment areas were fenced, high fenced, to keep deer from crossing from one treatment into another.
That is correct. And then the other major improvement is they did all of their culling with very traditional means, hunter and gun. Now, they were intense about it, about as intense as you could be and from a concerted effort. But we decided that, technology and advancements, we went net gun helicopter approach and captured randomly. And over the years, the data I presented with you, Bronson, I've presented several times across the nation on various venues, was collected from 2006 to 2016. And in that time frame, to give people a reference, we captured about 5,447 bucks. And we in the 7 years that we culled 1,333 bucks in 7 years. So on the moderate and the intense pasture, obviously the control pasture was all catch and release.
And regarding that efficiency, in the intensive treatment, remind people how effective your technique was regarding what proportion on average was the yearling age class culled?
Well, the reason we called it the intensive pasture is because we did cull all the way down into the yearling age class on that area. And the moderate, we started culling at 3 and up. And at 3 and up, both areas, I keep saying pasture, both areas are the same, right? So in the intensive, we'll start there. The yearlings had to have 6 points or more to live. And that was recommended through Parks and Wildlife. That's kind of what they did at Kerr and at Wildlife Management Area. There was this menagerie of inputs of how we came to that number. But nonetheless, that 6 points or more equated to the yearlings that we killed, which would be 5 points or less, would be 94% of the yearlings we caught were culled because of that over the course of that 7 years. And we certainly didn't catch every yearling every year. So some got through, but that by no means, that means that every yearling that we didn't catch lived. There's still droughts, there's still coyotes, there's still environmental impacts. So we basically eliminated recruitment in that pasture, and hence why we had to stop culling at year 7, because we were literally running out of bucks in that area, the intensive area, because we had culled them all or so strongly in the young age class.
And so the bottom line with that is, I guess, 2 things to me. You were efficient at a scale that's remarkable, number one, but you're never going to be able to replicate that.
No, we were. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I forgot. I didn't really answer your question there. Yes, our efficiency, and I actually had I have a graph somewhere on that computer, take me 10 minutes to find it. It shows the efficiency, us compared to even the King Ranch study of man hours per cull. And we were in the ballpark of 20 to, I think we were almost 30 times more efficient in man hours per cull capture than the King Ranch was. And that was professional hunters with a real sense of purpose to go out and kill things. And then if you want to back that down to your average person hunting on the average property, I mean, the magnitude is so great. I mean, it has to be in the 40, 50 fold area at best of what our intensity would be to the average person. So we felt that within a 3-year period of by the time an age class was 1, 2, and 3, and they went through 3 years of capture, we really had a very good hold on that cohort. We caught them 3 times, and we pretty much knew it was extremely rare, to the point that I can't even think of an incident right now off the top of my head of an animal slipping through that we'd have a 6, 7-year-old animal later down the road that had never been caught before. I mean, out of a data set that had, 30, this massive data set, to say the least, it would just happen on the rare occasion. So we had our hands around that deer herd quite well and knew them quite well.
So, but because of environmental variation, because that all bucks are breeding, young bucks, middle-aged bucks, mature bucks, bucks with large antlers, bucks with small antlers, I mean, it goes on and on, all the different reasons. The bottom line, the take-home point is that whether you had this extreme culling starting at the yearling age class, or whether in this moderate treatment that began at 3.5 years of age, the end result was you saw no difference in terms of, quote, genetic improvement. Genetics were not impacted.
That's correct. Yeah, and we know that for not just because we measured antlers. We also caught 900, and we also assigned 963 offspring back to their sires. And that allowed us to do some amazing things, get parental scale of who bred, or whose father is this, and so forth and so on, and got us what we call a breeding value, which we can get into a little later probably. But it is, yeah, so we know that not only did our antlers not improve, we kind of dug deeper than that with breeding value. We know kind of why the antlers didn't improve. And there's a myriad of reasons, and environmentally, the environment, I guess is the best way to say it, is probably the predominant one in that.
What was the adult sex ratio in that intensive pasture, Donnie?
Well, it started out about 1 to 1.5, 1 to 2, roughly in there, and it moved all the way to about 1 to 7. And because of that, that is part of this myriad of reasons I just said of why antlers didn't improve. We kind of created our own negative feedback loop, Steve, that we culled that, we widened that gap of buck-doe ratio so much that not all the does were bred in their first estrus cycle. So, because there were just so few bucks, because we were killing them all at 1, 2, 3, et cetera. And so this significant portion of does that got moved to their second estrus cycle moved the, obviously then moved the average parturition date later, and meaning late born fawns, right? So we had late born fawns happening more frequently. Late born fawns had less time to grow antlers. And then by the time they hit their yearling antler size, the year that we would catch them and judge them, they were on average smaller. So over the course of 7 years of culling, the fascinating thing about it is our yearling in the intensive pasture, not in the moderate, it stayed the same in the moderate, but in the intensive pasture, our average score for yearlings went down over time. The antler score went down. And that was very counterintuitive when we know our average sire score went up on the y-axis, right? It went from like 125 to 145, about a 20-inch jump on your average sire out there. So we made a significant gains on how big the father would be out there, the average father, but we lost ground on what the yearling antlers would be. And the reason being is because we thought we kept feeding that negative feedback loop. And yet another reason why we decided to pull the plug on the culling. We could never see ourselves breaking that cycle. It was too strong.
Yeah, and that's part of so often in our podcasts and in our educational outreach, we say it depends. And the difficulty in deer management is making a single statement that always works. You can't. There is no one size fits all deer management statement or strategy. There are so many confounding factors. An intensive culling program, in theory, could be used to improve genetic composition. That people have done in breeding pens and research facilities. You can improve that if you can control all the other factors. But in a real world situation, you can't control all those confounding effects. Your balanced sex ratio, you end up with inefficient breeding, and you have second and third estrus breeding and late born fawns, and it's just a complex system that we're managing. We're using relatively simple principles to try to manage a complex system, and people get frustrated because there's not a simple, easy fix for deer management.
I couldn't agree more. One of my sayings in wildlife management is that the only general rule of thumb there are no general rules of thumb. And once you grasp that, and then you'll get, because look, I'm sure you guys get it. I get people frustrated with me because I don't give straight answers either. Yes, you should do that. Like, well, and you hem and haw and you navigate the waters, but it's not and certainly not today's society that people would rather have that immediate satisfaction. But in good conscience, I can't provide that. I have to give. I know what I know, and I think we ought to convey that the best we can for each situation.
Donnie, I want to clarify something. After presentations we've given, articles, so forth, popular articles, you and I are sometimes privy to the feedback that we get from that. Let me clarify something you said, or let me allow you to explain that a little bit better, because you said that as yearling in your intensive treatment area, as yearling antler size year after year went down, but the antler score of the sires went up and up.
Yeah, okay, I see, I know where you're going.
Okay,
yeah.
That was not a genetic improvement of the sires. It was because you harvested or culled all of the sires with small antlers.
Right. That's what we call a sculpted cohort. And so if you tell me that you cull deer and you've been doing it for 10 years and you shoot every 8 point that you see, and now we don't have any more 8 points. Well, yeah, because you shoot them. That doesn't mean you genetically made your ranch not produce 8 points. The same is for what example you just gave. So as we're going along, each age class is a certain amount of them is caught and brought in and culled, and that's the bottom portion of them that gets removed. So therefore, the new average gets higher every time. So that's how we got a sire that was significantly larger than, let's say, the treatment area, because the control area, because the control area had no harvest whatsoever in it or culling. So as we keep knocking off the bottom portion, the average keeps getting higher and higher, and that's what we call a sculpted cohort. And it is. I have an exact statement in my speech that I give that the sculpted cohorts give the illusion of genetic change, but they are not genetic change. Do not be confused by those two things. And frankly, I think I would say 95% of the people who do cull and have this, they have, most likely if you're culling, certainly in Texas, let's take Texas for example, you're culling, you're probably also supplemental feeding. And when you marry those two things together, and you do it long enough, you probably get better deer for a couple of reasons. One, you're not only committed to your ranch at that point to make it better because you're putting economic and time and sweat effort into it. So you're doing some good things there. But there's this thing called nutritional generational gains, or generational nutritional gains, however you want to put it. But as deer live on high nutrition, every generation gets a little better, a little better, a little better. And so I think the marriage of that happening with people who cull at the same time, for some reason they rarely give the nutrition to its due. It gives it its credit that it's due, because nutrition over a 15 elevated nutrition over a 10-15 year period is definitely going to produce you bigger deer. We've got research to prove that. Now, the culling, you probably did it at a scale that was really inconsequential, because of our scale. We can talk to that effort of what it takes. So what happens is, but for some reason, people then return, and when they tell me that I've been culling for 10 years and man, we got bigger deer than we ever have, and it definitely works. And I usually just ask them, well, do you protein feed? Yeah, of course I do. Okay, well, have you ever thought about that's how you're getting your gains instead of your culling, or you're getting your gains with protein feed in spite of your culling? And that usually sets them back for a pause, but they don't quite fully understand it. And to bring this full circle, part of that confusion is that sculpted cohort combined with generational increases over time in antler size due to elevated elevated nutrition. And so that's a complicated system to kind of wrap your mind around, and why most people don't get it right away. You really kind of have to mull that over for a while, and your ranch, your area, and how that could happen on your property.
Yeah, in those properties, we get the same thing in our neck of the woods, and it seems like that's the single most common comment we get is either me or I know so and so, and they have been quote culling 8-pointers for the past whatever years, how many ever years, and we rarely see an 8-pointer now. Well, it's because you kill them all. The only way you can really deal with that is walk away and don't harvest that population for a decade, and let's see if you're still not producing 8-pointers. But you can't simultaneously be removing those animals and then saying it's a genetic improvement.
Right.
Yeah, Bronson, let's remind listeners about an earlier podcast way back when we first started, where we talked about Stephen Webb's modeling results, where we use a genetic model to look at potential culling impacts on genetic improvement in here. And your field test was an excellent field test of our model, which is a theoretical model, and we had the same kind of problem in that model, in that we ended up very intensively culling animals. Up about around 55 to 60% of the males were removed in this model every year, and we did not in the model allow for the second and third breeding factor confounding effect there. So that wasn't part of our modeling result. But after culling very intensively, 50 to 60% of the bucks every year were lopped off based on their actual known score within the model. We showed very limited effect on genetic improvement after 20 years of that heavy harvest. And so our modeling results and your field work, extensive project field work, shows that with even serious, significant culling, greater than a property could do with normal harvest rates, you cannot impact the genetic composition of a free ranging, or even your property was fenced, but within a amount of area, you can't change the genetic composition of the population using a culling operation. You agree with that as a conclusion from your?
Yes, I do. And a matter of fact, the eeriness about y'all's model, Stephen's model that came out a couple years before we really kind of started publicizing our data, is that his prediction on, let's say, the gains that you would get from culling in 20 years, when we ran the same thing with our numbers, not your model, but our numbers running it through, we came to the almost exact, I think ours was like, you'll gain, and let's not, I'm going to make a statement here and then I'm going to clarify that for our listeners here, but you would gain in 20 years, like little less than 5 inches of antler growth and 20 years of perfect culling. Perfect, no mistakes, all that, right? So 5 inches. And so right there, I just made a statement that culling worked in a weird way. I did, but it only works to the level of maybe if you were absolutely perfect and insanely intense, which you won't be. I mean, let's be honest, you won't be. It only worked at you gained 5 inches. At the same time, if you go back, and one of the things I talk about all the time is the Comanche Fate study, which is a real well-known deer density supplemental feed study in this part of the world, at least. We found that all things held given the same, a mature buck on protein feed versus a mature buck off protein feed, the mature buck on it will be 15 inches bigger. So where do you want to put your money and time and effort? I mean, you're going to get 15 out of supplemental feeding or adding nutritional. And by supplemental feed, that can mean a lot of different things. Our particular version in Texas is pelleted feed, but y'all have a lot of more natural ways to do it or nicer ways to do it. So anyway, I completely agree with that model. It was eerie how closely those things came out. I was actually commended Stephen on several talks that I've done and what a great job he did on that and how close those things came. It was kind of crazy.
One thing, if you don't mind, guys, I'd like to discuss, but you jogged my memory on something, Steve. Remember when we were building, and by we, I mean Stephen, building that modeling, consulting with geneticists and so forth. Remember that we used that study from Texas Parks and Wildlife, where in a period of 8 years, and I think, guys, the reason I'm going down this path is because of magazines, because of the internet and social media. Your typical person that's not a biologist, they're going to see examples of, quote, genetic progress, but it's in the context of a controlled breeding situation. So when we were refining that model, Steve, remember we were using that Texas Parks and Wildlife study where in a span of 8 years, they essentially doubled the number of antler points on yearling bucks. Mm-hmm. But how that worked is they were able to control both the sire and the dam. So they had this, I'll say perfect knowledge, but pretty perfect knowledge of the phenotype of those animals. Donnie, you brought it up a moment ago, the breeding value of those animals. They are able to pair as best they can genetically the best to genetically the best. And sure enough, doing that, the best, breeding the best, breeding the best, you do that over 8 different times, 8 years in a row, and they monitored progress with the yearling age class to speed the process up. They, if I remember correctly, went from an average of about 4 points on yearlings to 7 or 8 points. So almost, for that specific trait, doubled it. So we're not saying that genetic manipulation isn't going to work. Obviously, it does, but it is within the context of complete and total control. Donnie's situation is a free-ranging deer herd. Yeah, there are some fences, there are some borders, but they are not manipulating who's breeding who. That is a natural process of who's breeding who. And the result is that no genetic progress is made.
Yeah. And Bronson, can we go back to another key word? Donna, you've mentioned a couple of key words. One was the genetic impact. And so we've been talking about that not being feasible in a natural situation. The other key word that you talked about is that sculpted cohort, and that speaks to the other type of culling that can be accomplished where you're actually managing a standing crop or a cohort to affect what the average animal is and what that average represents. So, and that's the source of the confusion that has resulted recently in some of our social media posts, where we had some research results looking at tagged yearlings and no age males in a free range population in Mississippi. And we showed that if you grouped males at 2 years of age based on their antler characteristics, their antler size, and followed them for multiple years, the lower third basically of the 2-year-old age class would have smaller antlers at 4 years of age than the upper third of the 2-year-old age class at 4 years of age. And so we were, that result suggests that you can sculpt a cohort or an age class as they age if you need to harvest male deer as part of population control or for some other reason.
Yeah.
That's the source of the confusion. Is culling is a word that means to selectively harvest an animal, but the goal, the reason for doing it is that there's two big forks in the road. You can apply this tool. Are you doing it for genetic improvement, or are you trying to sculpt the cohort?
Yeah, and I say that differently. I say the exact same thing in my talk, Steve, but I change it. And I have a little section on my talks that kind of bring up these common comments, is what I call them. And the first one is actually, I make a statement: the study that we did is wrong. Culling bucks and does should be a part of maintaining a healthy deer herd. That's what I hear as feedback sometimes. So, but you're absolutely right. There's two types of culling. I call it, what we tried to do on the Comanche study is that we tried to cull for genetic change. That's that one fork in the road. But what most people, or a lot of people, think of when they think of culling, it is just really maintaining a proper herd of both buck-doe ratios and density, population density for your carrying capacity, right? So I don't really call it sculpted cohorts when I go that other way. I call it just kind of herd maintenance or maintaining those proper numbers. But it is the same. We're saying the same thing. So in that, I get a lot of comments about that. Well, why do you, this is crazy. Of course, I'm going to shoot bucks. Of course, I'm going to shoot this or that. Okay, yes, I'm not arguing that point, and that's not what we're saying. By all means, please maintain your deer herd at proper levels, both buck-doe ratios and at population density. We're first and foremost biologists. That's what we all advocate, right? Now, I would make this statement to that end, is that very few people on this planet actually need to kill bucks to maintain proper densities. Actually, now you guys might be over there in a spot in the world that may be true, because you got your horrible fawn crops in a given year is 80%. So, and me, I'm going through yet another drought this year. And if I get into the double digits, I'm going to feel a little lucky. I've had less than 2 inches of rain for the entire year, 2020, and we're at late April right now. So I'm in a hell of a drought. So this idea that everybody has the same set of rules for harvesting things is completely, you should throw that out the window and think about that. Am I killing bucks because I just want to kill some bucks? And if that's so, fine. It's America and you bought your hunting license, go do it. But don't do it under the guise that I'm either making a genetic change or that I'm maintaining the herd because I have to get some of these bucks out and then I go shoot some 2-year-old 8-point. Well, I don't understand why that would be helpful from a herd management standpoint. Now, if you have mouths that need to be removed and you can't get them all done on the antler, then shoot some bucks. And yes, your data that you showed and our data supports that, shoot the weaker of any of those age classes that you choose to dig into. And that will help you sculpt that cohort later on down. Your bigger deal will make it. My argument is that, first off, I really want you to prove to me that you actually need to do that with the buck herd, because I think people do it because they want to, and they want to have an excuse to shoot bucks, not because they need to. And that's a very unpopular opinion, and I'll probably get some hate mail, which again won't be the first time, so that's okay.
And I did a unofficial survey of our deer biologists in the state of Mississippi a few years ago. And I asked them, of all the properties you go out and do land surveys and deer surveys on, and you work with the landowner to help them manage their deer population, what percentage of those have optimum habitat quality where the deer are able to get their full nutritional requirements from the habitat? And less than 5% was their answer. So 95% of the properties don't have enough food for the deer population. So over here on this side of the Mississippi River, where, you know, I don't know, Bronson, what was our rainfall last year? 80 inches or something?
I would have to look it up, but essentially we get more in a month than Donnie gets in a year on a good year.
Average
Thanks for rubbing that in.
55 inches.
Oh my God.
We have excellent fawn crops most years, and there's not enough food, and we've had not enough food produced naturally for quite a while, and it's been an effort, a significant effort by the biologists to get people to harvest enough does, and they get tired, and they don't want to keep shooting the does, and so they are more willing to shoot some bucks. And so that's why I think part of Bronson and my approach to selective harvest for cohort improvement of the standing crop, that comes back to, all right, well, you won't shoot enough does, so how about if you also shoot some bucks, some younger bucks, to get those mouths off the field, off your property?
Yeah, and that's why I caveated that with, you know, in y'all's area that may not be true, and everybody lives in their own little bubble, and my bubble is the South Texas one, and we're just never in that situation from a recruitment standpoint. We just don't have those big influxes year in year. And then when we do, we cherish those cohorts all the way through maturity. So yeah, every region has its different challenges for sure. I wouldn't mind trying to live down a few 120% fawn crops for a few years in a row, though, just to see how it is. Wouldn't bother me.
I think of it like this too, Donnie, is we're talking about this sculpted cohort. When Steve and I are working with a lot of these hunters or properties or so forth, you have this accumulation of below average in terms of antler size, the accumulation of below average antler sized bucks at 4.5 years of age or 5.5 years of age. That group has indeed sculpted the cohort, but they've sculpted it the wrong way.
Yeah.
In other words, they have taken the very best of that cohort, sometimes at 2, but typically at 3 years of age. You know, so we're talking about a buck at 3 years of age in our neck of the woods, going to score in the 120s or 130s. It's a good deer. For a 3.5-year-old buck, that's an outstanding buck. That's a buck that's going to grow to 150 or 160. And so what happens year after year after year, then we work with them, visit with them, we see their data, and it's like, you know, all of our 3.5-year-old bucks score this, but we don't see that big of an improvement at 4.5 and 5.5 years of age. It's like they grow to 3.5 and it just flattens out. And it's like, well,
yeah.
The reason that's happening is you've sculpted the top end too early.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
What Steve and I recommend, it's basically you people, your situation, your club, you have this expectation of removing X amount of bucks a year. How about we turn that around? How about we flip it? So at 3.5 years of age or 4 or whatever, if X amount of bucks, if it is a desire that you're going to remove that number of bucks off of your property every year, why don't we sculpt it the other way and start taking the lower quality middle-aged bucks and let the higher quality middle-aged bucks grow to maturity. And then you start getting, now you get what you're managing for. And all the time, we're not saying, Steve and I have to qualify it at the beginning of the conversation, in the middle of the conversation, at the end of the conversation. You will see no genetic improvement from doing this whatsoever.
Right, but it's confusing because if you did what you're saying, you will see great antler improvement, terrific antler improvement. Now, that doesn't mean anything genetically, but that's a fascinating approach, guys. I really like it. Something that's completely foreign to my country down in here of how we do things, but it makes total sense into the dynamics that you're dealing with. And what's really nice about that, it for me, staring on the outside looking in, one, it's really easy to achieve. It's management by restraint, first off, and or refocus your target species, your target animal. And two, it's extremely sustainable over the years, as long as you keep getting these high, big, fawn crops, which, there's no indication that you want. So, and three, I'm like, maybe it was a one, but it will happen really quickly. Like within 3 years, you would have 4, 5, and 6-year-old bucks running around that are going to be pushing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, who knows what. A really cool approach. I like that.
You just you made a great point that is a fundamental assumption. Again, Steve and I working in our bubble, but me stepping back, I don't know if we mentioned that enough, but you're exactly right. We have the constant throughput of recruitment. We have this constant pipeline. Every year we're recruiting more bucks in, so that is a fundamental assumption we make. So you're right. That's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, and it's a good assumption where you are. I mean, until global warming totally kicks in and we're all living in the Sonora, but till then you're fine.
Let's hope that's a few years away.
Yeah, I think we're okay.
Steve, you want to add anything?
Well, I think, Bronson, that Donnie, his comment about how that's a great way to improve antler size in older males. I like that. And there's a reason, selfish reason I like him saying that, because we have a book available that someone might want to get more into this in more detail. You want to tell listeners if they'd like to better understand the differences that we've been talking about today. We have a whole chapter on explaining the difference for genetic improvement and why that doesn't work, and culling for sculpting and improving the standing crop cohort. We have a whole chapter on that. And then also explanation of why other things, the specific effects that we're talking about. So where would a person find that book?
Well, you would find that book where you find most books nowadays. Just go to Amazon, and that's the beauty of this podcast stuff. Now I can put the link in the show notes. So when we release this, someone can go to the show notes and click on it. But essentially, just go to Amazon and search for selective harvest strategies. And Steve, the genesis of that, just like dealing with this conversation with Donnie, is that we've been having this conversation for 20 years. We've been giving presentations about it and writing articles, and it was finally time to take all of that. And, probably, Steve, we were naive at the beginning. We thought this was going to be, 10 or 20 pages. That ought to kind of wrap it up. And it ended up being, if I remember correctly, 125 pages, that little short book full of graphs and all these different explanations. But that is really, it takes a really long form. If you're ready to jump in and really understand Donnie's approach and what they're doing or what they attempted to do, the harvesting scenarios that we're talking about in Mississippi and in the Southeast, we lay all of that out in that book. And so, yeah, it's going to take some reading time and some studying time, but it's your one-stop shop if you want to fully evaluate selective harvest.
And the title, Strategic Harvest Systems, Breaking Through the Buck Management Glass Ceiling. Donnie, you know how creative Bronson is. You've known him your adult life. He came up with
Long time.
that cool about breaking through the buck management glass ceiling. And 3-year-old age class we see consistently mismanaged by harvesting the better quality 3-year-olds. That's the concept of the glass ceiling. And there's so many properties in the eastern United States that are shooting their best 3-year-olds, and if a better 3-year-old gets through, they shoot them at 4, and they never get to see this improvement in fulfillment of their potential antler size. It's just a glass ceiling. And so the book that we created based on our collective writings over the years explains how to break through that glass ceiling, how to fix the problem.
You know, that's a great book, guys. I've read it myself, and we'll soon be going back to it because we're currently writing a journal article for the Comanche study, and then eventually we'll be writing a popular book about that culling study as well. And I'm sure I'll have to reference y'all's book because it's a great book. But that brings it just reminds me of, to bring home the point a little bit, we're all a product of our environment. And if we were to try that, or we were to do the exact strategy you said, where you're harvesting your best 3-year-olds, and then if they get by, and 4-year-olds, et cetera, let's say you took that into South Texas and you took that strategy down here, you would quickly be exposed by just you would run out of deer pretty quickly, easily within a 10-year period, probably more like 8-year. Because what would happen is, this year's a great example, 2020, and then 2011 was another great example. We're just going to miss an entire cohort of fawns coming in because the recruitment will be, I've had my averages. I've had recruitment as high as 100%, but I've had it as low as 8%. So when you have 8% recruitment on 113,000 acres that has a healthy coyote population, and is already in a drought, you can pretty much just write that cohort off. I mean, from a statistical analysis, for sure. And so what would happen if you're killing those 3s, 4s every year? We have to kind of stack our cohorts together. So that's why we personally don't try not to shoot deer till they're 7, just to give us a little bit more time to get those 6, 7, 8-year-olds and try to group that whole together. And then that group gets replaced by another 3-year group, et cetera, if that makes any sense. But we can't just work off of one cohort replacing the next. So what's funny is that when you say that strategy, it would just never work in South Texas. You'd be quickly exposed. You would know that whatever I'm doing is wrong. You would know it because you just run out of deer.
Yeah. It depends.
It always depends. It's always a context, where you're at, what's the situation, what's the environmental variability. It always depends.
For sure.
Well, gentlemen, I think hopefully we covered this topic pretty well. Hopefully it was thorough enough, kind of explaining both sides of the coin here, different perspectives and strategies and so forth. So, well, Donnie, catch us up real quick. What's going on in your life? Anything different? Any new stuff you're involved in you want to tell everyone about?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we're in a drought. That's the bummer part. We're waiting for Wayne. We're making lemonade out of lemons. We're redoing ponds and making them deeper while they're empty now and things like that from a ranch perspective. From a research side, myself, well, I'd say Tim Fulbright, Dr. Tim Fulbright, Cesar Faberd Wildlife Research Institute, you guys know well, Dave Hewitt, and Charlie D. Young, all doctors from over there, and myself are writing the Comanche Faith popular book we're about on chapter 8 now of the writing. Tim's doing an incredible job. He's moved up to Colorado and living a little paradise up there, but and it's been fascinating revisiting all that research and really diving into it from a holistic perspective when we put it all in one place like that. And that is 17 years worth of supplemental feed, density, vegetation, all the elements that one could think of inside there. That's all coming together in that research. So we're really having fun doing that. Charlie is currently, like I said, writing the culling study for Journal of Wildlife Management, hopefully a monograph there. And after that comes out, we'll quickly turn, maybe not quickly, but we'll turn into start writing a popular book about that as well. So in the next few years, you'll see both of those hit the floors pretty quick.
And
Well,
Bronson,
maybe that needs. Oh, go ahead, Steve.
I was going to change the subject a little bit. I want to, we started out today's topic with the fact that some of our listeners had misunderstood one thing or another. And I want to tell our listeners how much we appreciate them paying attention to what we're putting out. We're being successful, and the measure of success is that people are listening to what we say. And the problem is sometimes we try to simplify our story, because if we're dealing with a tweet or a Facebook post, we've got a very limited amount of space to package it into. So keep it simple is the approach. But the simplicity sometimes causes trouble because we don't get to spend as much time explaining, well, but this depends on this, this, and this, and this. And so thank you, listeners, and for paying attention. And we just appreciate that. And we just hope that you continue to pay attention and integrate the multiple pieces that we put out. And if you listen long enough to our podcasts and to enough of them, we will get it out to you in a usable format. And we've had some of our listeners say they listen to a podcast, an individual episode, 3 or 4 times, and they keep getting more and more out of it by re-listening to it. So,
Yeah, let me echo that, Steve. You've heard me say this a lot. We all, including Donnie, we suffer from what is technically called the curse of knowledge, meaning that we are so familiar with this topic that we sometimes miss the details. We assume that someone knows what we're talking about because we know the topic so well, and so sometimes we miss those details. So it really is. I'm grateful that we have an audience that asks questions. So when we had recently we had a Facebook post about what you talked about earlier, Steve, a free range experiment here in Mississippi, and some of the audience said, "No, wait a minute, you had that podcast with Donnie Drager a year ago where you said this, and now you're saying that." So yeah, it's gratifying that they're paying attention. They're eager to learn and read, and we're happy to clarify, happy to do stuff like this to clear it up.
Yeah, well, I appreciate all those comments as well. Not all of them are the sweetest. I remember, I can't remember who sent it to me. You guys will appreciate this, but it was my buddy in College Station sent me this one. It got posted on some board, where they just start talking about things, and he took a screenshot of it. And after the guy listened to it, and I don't know if it was one of the articles, our podcast together or what, but the guy's response was that the only thing he said, and it was pretty beautiful, I admit, it was that biologist is an idiot. And that was it. So, well,
and we all agree with that.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that either. But on most subjects, on this one, all right, let's challenge it.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, thank you for carving out a little bit of time. It's actually really fun. We're all doing the social distancing thing, and the face-to-face contact is well, it's non-existent at this point. So it's great to see each of you and have a great conversation. Hope y'all are doing well, and hopefully in the next few weeks or months or something, we'll be back to some semblance of normality. At least I hope.
Hey, Bronson, one last request to our audience. You're going to post this on our YouTube channel, and let us know if you enjoy this medium of actually seeing us talking about our podcast. If you like it, then we'll do it some more in the future. If not, then we understand that you might not want to look at our faces. Bronson has regularly over the years told me I have a face for radio.
Yeah, I have a face for radio and a voice for newsprint. So I strike out on all fronts. Yeah, that's a good point, Steve. We're hoping to capitalize on a new medium. Some people really enjoy seeing. Some people just don't do the podcast thing in the normal way. They use YouTube to listen to their podcast. So yeah, we were thinking about taking advantage of this opportunity and see how people like it. If people like it, we'll keep doing it and we'll go forward that way. Good point. Well, okay, guys, we will wrap it up here. I enjoyed it. And Donnie, maybe next time we'll talk about the Faith Comanche study sometime soon. I don't think we've covered that topic.
No, we dabbled in it when we did the nutrition and supplemental feed, but it probably deserves its own. You bet.
Certainly does. Yeah, we'll dig into the details on that topic. Okay, gentlemen, we'll talk to you later.
Take care, all.
Be safe.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.